In recent years, the exposure of the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers have once again put tax havens on the public opinion radar. In the last 2 years, criticism of these places has multiplied all throughout the world. Politicians, businessmen, soccer players, singers, or simply investors and savers, many people transfer part of their fortunes to these places, supposedly to pay fewer taxes. That's why many critics state that if it weren't for these millionaire paradises, the 2008 financial crisis would have been less of a crisis. We're told that without these paradises, governments wouldn't have to make so many cuts, would all pay fewer taxes, and ultimately it would make things much better. Well, the question now is, how true is all of this? Are tax havens really so bad for the general welfare of a population? Well, let's check it out. The first thing we need to be clear about is what a tax haven is. Well, a tax haven is nothing more than a jurisdiction with low taxes, high legal security, and an extreme amount of protection of the saver's privacy. This is very important because cutting taxes isn't enough to turn a territory into a tax haven. Not at all. You see, the international investors and savers who use these jurisdictions really want to protect their assets. That's why they not only demand low taxes, but also legal security. That is, in addition to low taxes, they want to ensure that their assets are safe from any kind of robbery, nationalization, confiscation, corruption, inflation, etc. Therefore, what's common to all tax havens, even more than low taxes, is legal safety. There are the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, Singapore, Hong Kong, Cyprus, Jersey, and Bermuda. All of these are jurisdictions that we recognize as important financial centers, and they're characterized by their high legal safety. Savers essentially know that the government's not going to take all of their money. It's precisely this combination of low taxes and high legal security that makes these territories receive so much capital from around the world and grow at rates much higher than in other countries. And no, operating in these places isn't illegal in itself. Despite what the media might suggest, appearing in the Paradise Papers or in the Panama Papers doesn't necessarily mean that you've committed a crime. In fact, most of the names on these lists are those of entirely innocent people. There are people like Alex Crivellé and Shakira whose assets have a legal origin and who use tax havens to minimize their tax bills within the bounds of the law. This may seem more or less immoral, but it's perfectly legal. Another very important detail which we usually forget is that these tax havens are a refuge for millions of citizens who have the misfortune of being born in authoritarian and extractive countries. I mean, we all know that there are many countries in the world where the most basic human rights aren't guaranteed, or where authoritarian governments arbitrarily decide who to repress or persecute. That is, many investors don't seek protection just for lower taxes, they are also escaping political, ideological, and religious persecution. Think, for example, of political dissidents in Russia or Venezuela, or families who are threatened by kidnapping in Mexico, or entrepreneurs that come from countries with few guarantees, like Zimbabwe or Belarus. Well, they all benefit from being able to access jurisdictions that guarantee the safety that tax havens do. Because it's also a matter of justice. Allow me to explain. Most people think it's an aberration when some states prevent their citizens from leaving the country, as happened with the Berlin Wall. Well, we should also probably think it's an aberration when states prevent their citizens from taking their savings out of the country and depositing it in a more protective foreign jurisdiction. That is, of course, if they're doing it in compliance with the law. In any case, the truth is that both the media and politicians greatly exaggerate the consequences that these tax havens have on our economies. So let's check it out.
A very exaggerated role.
According to many politicians and journalists, tax havens are greatly responsible for all of the ills we suffer, such as the third world government's budget cuts, inequality, and underdevelopment. This is what the organization Oxfam argues, for example. Check this out.
The current global inequality crisis has a clear ally in tax havens. These jurisdictions represent the black hole where the development opportunities of millions of people around the world fall.
Well, first of all, we must state that Oxfam's definition of a tax haven is a bit lax. In their opinion, a tax haven is any country that has very low taxes, especially for foreign investment. This definition includes countries like the Netherlands, Ireland, and Luxembourg, which of course don't receive such a qualification from the European Commission, the European Parliament, or the OECD. But alright, even with this definition, let's see how important those tax havens really are. To do so, let's take the case of Spain, a European Union country with a high average income that has many economic problems as well as high taxes. Well, based on their government's own data, Spain invested 40.91 billion euros overseas in 2016. Of this total, 9.54 billion ended up in what Oxfam calls tax havens. 9.54 billion is less than 5% of everything Spanish people invested in the entire world, including Spain, during that year. So really, the reality is that the relevance of these tax havens isn't quite as great as it's made out to be. In fact, the highest estimates place the world heritage of tax havens at about $7.6 trillion. And that might seem like a huge number, but when you look at it from a global perspective, it's actually quite small. So we might not like it, but the truth is that tax havens can hardly be responsible for the big problems that many critics say they are. But that's not all here. Let's return to Spain's situation. 87% of the Spanish investments that went to Oxfam's tax havens in 2016 were concentrated in Ireland, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. We're talking about a bit over $8 billion here. Well, in that same year, these three countries invested over $12 billion into Spain. As you can see, tax havens not only don't decapitalize the business fabric of a country as fiscally uncompetitive as Spain, in fact, it's quite the opposite. These tax havens have helped capitalize the weak Spanish economy.
Luxembourg is the country that invests the most in Spain in factories, buildings, farms, employment. But it isn't public, but private money. Most comes from companies and savings vehicles established in the country. Javier G. Llorin, economics journalist in El Confidencial.
But having said that, let's look at another key question. How much revenue do governments lose as a result of tax havens? Is it true that without them there would have been no cuts during the crisis? Well, let's see.
The story of the milkmaid.
As we've seen, one of the most common criticisms tax havens get is that if we hadn't had such unfair competition, governments wouldn't have had to make budget cuts as a result of the 2008 financial crisis. But is it true? Well, let's go back to our Spanish case again. As you know, this is one of the countries that suffered the most from the recession. Well, according to data from the Spanish Ministry of Economy, the investment accumulated in Oxfam-defined tax havens year after year amounts to $80 billion. Well, if all of that money had been accumulated in Spain instead of tax havens, the extra income that the Spanish state would have received would have been approximately 1 to 1.5 billion euros. Again, sounds like quite a bit of money, but I promise you it's a really minuscule amount in the overall scheme of things. Give you an idea about that, it's about 0.1% of the Spanish GDP and less than 0.5% of all taxes collected. In other words, it has a very limited impact. And if instead of Spain we took a look at what's happening in the rest of the world, the situation is pretty similar. In fact, even if we take the highest estimates of the Tax Justice Network, which is the source that's usually used to denounce tax havens, we'll see that they show a global collection loss of about $200 billion, which is barely 1% of all the tax revenues of the world's governments. No, the truth is that contrary to what's usually claimed, tax havens aren't to be blamed for the cuts, nor do they force us to pay more taxes or really harm our economies. We may not like it much, but it's just the way things are. In 1980, Ireland was actually poorer than Spain. Today, thanks to these policies, it's the second richest country in the Eurozone. To improve the general welfare, we need more companies, not more politicians, and not more public spending. The problems that countries with economic difficulties face don't usually come from tax havens, but from their politicians. But now it's your turn. Do you think that tax havens should be persecuted? Please leave your answer in the comments below, as well as in this survey. And I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, don't forget to check check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.